Hey everybody, this is Charles for Premier Guitar, and it's my pleasure to be here in the inner sanctum at the Rickenbacker factory with Rickenbacker Chairman and CEO John Hall, and we're here very, very special place. This is John's personal guitar collection as well as the de facto Rickenbacker Museum. So John, why don't you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here? Where should we even start?
Yeah, that's a good question. We have a little bit of everything in here. To be honest with you, it never was intended to be a collection or a museum. It just sort of happened. So as a result, we have, like I said, just a little bit of everything that's been left over. These examples here are from the 60s, the little thin body with no pickguard where the controls are located. Whereas if you go back to the 1950s, it's a thicker instrument, and you've got the traditional pickguard with circuitry mounted on the pickguard. It does illustrate rather nicely the evolution that occurs in our product line. So you've got a 50s instrument that morphs into a 60s instrument. It's really the same instrument, but it's not. Sort of like the old Volkswagen Bug. It's always the Bug, but every year was just a little bit different and evolved in its function, and that's certainly what's happened in our line. That's a 400 series guitar, and that particular one actually happens to be a low-cost student guitar that was manufactured under the Electro line rather than the Rickenbacker brand. But 400 series started first, and the 600 series, which was a deluxe version of the 400 series, sprung out of that. And of course the two pickup version of that, which I don't happen to have here, the two pickup version, the 450, is a guitar that a lot of people will remember as George Harrison acquiring on first trip to the U.S. when he was down in Benton, Illinois. This is a 1953 instrument, and it has a humbucking pickup. It actually has dual coils inside the magnet structure here. The switches allowed you to do coil splitting even, and that was a humbucker in 1953. However, Rickenbacker just didn't consider that to be a particularly interesting innovation and chose not to patent it.
Now we're also probably seeing, given this is back in '53, this must be the origins of the Capri shape and what later became the 325 and the 330 in some ways. You can see that starting to take shape there. Is that really where that began, in that profile?
Well, you can very clearly see the influence of Roger Rossmeisel, the German luthier that my father brought in to revitalize the Spanish guitars from Rickenbacker. And the front there with the German carve meaning that the edge of the instrument is actually lower than the center of the carving. It has a negative carve to it, which is kind of a difficult thing to do in production, but very characteristic of early German guitars. Roger Rossmeisel was a very skilled, classically trained luthier, and a lot of the little details that you see today come from that experience. Not only the F sound hole, but especially the cat's eye sound hole. That's something that comes out of the old Mittenwald school of lutherie. This is a 1953 instrument that was produced by Roger Rossmeisel, and the inlays on the fingerboard are really interesting because you can see it's actually a rectangle with the black and white portions on the diagonal. Well, if you eliminate the black portion, which kind of blends into the fingerboard anyway, you get our traditional triangular inlay shape. So that was the history of where that came from. And this instrument also has the German carved edge, the slash sound hole, and it really is the embodiment of so many of the little details that you look at and instantly say Rickenbacker now. The instrument shown right there is actually from the 60s when we were in the acoustic guitar market back then. After my dad passed away, I cleaned out his office, which had a huge old, really beat up walnut desk in it. And as much as I liked it, it just did not fit in, and the condition was pretty poor. So I carted the desk down, and I took it apart and set it out on the loading dock. And some of the acoustic guitar guys saw it and said, "Wait a minute, that's really got some wonderful walnut in it. Let us make a guitar out of it." So that guitar was made out of my father's desk. I can't say it's a great sounding guitar being walnut, but it certainly has some sentimental value.
These last three basses on the end, this is a model you all don't make anymore. Perhaps one day we'll revisit, I hope. But what can you tell the folks watching at home about this? Because it's an unusual and rare instrument in a relative sense.
Those are from the 4004 series. They're hollow body instruments that were made a little bit in the style of the 360 guitar. They're awfully large instruments. Personally, I've always felt they're a little unwieldy, but there is definitely a following for them. And I'm not sure whether there'll ever be enough market to warrant producing them again. Still, it's a classic design, and they'll be appreciated for a long time.
Now, that 8-string on the end has one of the more unusual headstocks that Rickenbacker ever crafted, I would guess.
It's been referred to as the Mr. Potato Head headstock before, and that's probably a good name for it. It was just a way to accommodate all of those keys. Chris Hillman's original 8-stringer, I think, was probably the first that had that headstock on it. This is a 1937 Rickenbacker bass, an upright bass, obviously, that was marketed along with an amplifier. The amplifier had a socket in the top, and the end pin would engage it such that the amplifier would stand by itself. Has the large wraparound magnet, very typical of the early Rickenbacker design. One of the very few instruments with an ebony fingerboard on it. But quite interesting. The body is actually made out of cast iron, and the machine heads on it are kind of an interesting machined design, rather interesting. But with a cast iron body, I guess it would be great for heavy metal.
Very all-business design, that's to be sure.
This is a 1930s electric violin, again utilizing the trademark Rickenbacker wraparound pickup. The body is produced out of bakelite. Very, very modern looking instrument, even by today's standards. I mean, I think this could be like a Klingon musical instrument. It's just stylish on its own, even though it's 1930s. Rickenbacker tried everything in the way of stringed instruments at one time, it seems.
It kind of leads us in some ways, too, to really the very important role that Rickenbacker played in the development of electric pickups as well. I mean, you guys are right there at the fore of what happened, correct?
Well, we invented the magnetic pickup and patented it. That's certainly been our claim to fame. This is a very classic example of a little different take on an electric violin. But the magnetic coil, the actual wraparound horseshoe magnets are quite clearly visible here. The idea was to concentrate the magnetic field as close to the string as possible so that you are sensing the string in all three dimensions. And, when you consider that almost all electric guitar pickups today are utilizing exactly the same principle, you understand the magnitude of this innovation. Yeah, sure, there's piezo pickups and all that, which are pretty neat in their own right, but magnetic is still the champion of electric guitar pickups.
Looking at the origins of the company, really, right, John?
This is the original Rickenbacker frying pan prototype, and they started work on this probably in 1929, 1930. It was finished in 1931 when it was used as the model for the patent. Unfortunately, it took about 6 to 7 years in order to obtain the patent because the patent commissioners did not believe that an electric guitar could work. So Adolf Rickenbacker finally ended up sending Sal Hoopy to Washington, who played a short concert to the patent commissioners using this guitar, with which he left with a freshly minted patent in hand. But the main thing here is the magnetic pickup. This was the birth of the electric guitar. The earliest electric guitar really goes back to about 1890. George Breed created an electrical guitar. And there's been a lot of starts and stops along the way. This is the one, though, that was commercially viable, and the design that essentially is still in use today. The concepts are all there. It's all the same. Magnets may have moved around a little bit, but the idea of a coil with strings that move with a magnet around it, that's still the way it's done today in most guitars.
There it is, folks, the reason we're all here.
From there he moved on to Bakelite plastic, since he was very much involved in injection molding of plastic and alternate materials, and even later moved on to making instruments out of sheet brass. This is actually brass. It's all soldered together. Just basically trying every avenue that he could to explore materials that were commonly available in that time.
I don't know how many of our readers and web viewers know about Rickenbacker's lap steel and pedal steel history here. And these are pretty cool looking.
Well, in fact, that's a very important part of our early history. Certainly the frying pan guitar was a Hawaiian lap steel guitar to begin with. So it's really where we came from. And well into the 50s, it was a market that Rickenbacker truly dominated. But at this point, it's a very limited market, and it was a market that we exited quite a while ago. There just aren't the production numbers to support that in mass numbers. Well, this is a so-called Tulip 400 type guitar, and its main claim to the fame is that Toots Thielmans, who played with the George Shearing Quintet, this was a guitar that he was often pictured with, and John Lennon saw Toots Thielman playing this, and Toots was an idol of John Lennon apparently, and that was the whole impetus for John wanting a Rickenbacker. He specifically asked for a Rickenbacker at the Hamburg Steinway shop based on his having seen Toots Thielman's playing this instrument. And it's quite unique because of the fact that it has the neck-through construction. It also had a rather unique system for strap. You could use a saxophone strap, which is just a strap around your neck with a hook to hang this guitar on. An early example, you can tell by the fact that it had the older headstock on it, sort of a transitional period before we went to the style that we currently utilize. But this does have the full wraparound pickup and magnet. This is an inserted neck, but you can see that it's partially neck through. It's a little different kind of a way to do things.
There's some very interesting contours in here I see as well that are sort of unique, both for you guys and electric guitars in general.
Well, this is a three-piece body, which is a little unusual, and the throat of the instrument here has been cut away, so there is a little better access to the higher end of the neck.
This must be one of the very earliest Capris here, which would ultimately become the 330 and kind of your signature model.
Well, that's right. You can see that the body contour is a little different than it is today, a little stouter in the lower bout, so to speak, and all of the curves are just slightly different. Once again, one of those evolutionary things. Over the years, we began to make some adjustments to make the thing a little more graceful.
What's over here, John? This looks, you started telling me that this is an actual Carl Wilson prototype?
That's right. We have kind of a collection of prototypes in this corner here. This guitar was an early instrument that I designed with Carl Wilson's input. It was intended to be the Carl Wilson limited edition. And we were looking for a solid body guitar that had some kind of modern things, a higher performance vibrato system, for instance, and humbucking pickups. The whole idea of our limited edition series was not really to replicate a guitar that an artist used, but in fact to be an instrument that he'd like to use his dream instrument, so to speak. So we came up with something a little different than a lot of Rickenbackers, kind of a unique design. And when he saw this, the only change that he wanted was a little more fancy carving on the upper bout there. Unfortunately, his health situation deteriorated very quickly, and subsequently the actual guitar that was chosen for production as the limited edition was chosen by his family in a different type of model entirely. This was an instrument that I worked with Jackson Brown to create. We went through a number of iterations on pickups, different types of fingerboards, and some interesting concepts here. Still within the Rickenbacker 600 body shape, but just trying some new things there. Unfortunately, the timing just wasn't right, and I don't think we've actually put out a limited edition since this one came out. Well, it may be legendary, but I would also agree in strange ways, because I think it's a little bit gimmicky, but put in the context of 1968, 1969, what was happening in Haight-Ashbury, Summer of Love, the idea of a light-up guitar, a color organ, change colors as you played, was definitely pretty psychedelic. It had 3 channels and was sensitive to bass, middle, and treble frequencies. It was capable of providing your own little built-in light show as you played, I guess.
Yeah, there's a 5th knob, or a 6th knob rather, back here towards the tail piece that I'm not familiar with. What is that exactly?
It's a sensitivity control that basically just determined how bright the lights would flash.
It's very important. Sometimes you need to keep it mellow.
That is a model 4002. That was an early so-called studio-type instrument, actually quite expensive in its time. I think back in the 70s, that was like a $1,200 instrument. It has bifiller wound pickups, which means it essentially has two windings in its coil, and one was high impedance to go into a traditional electric guitar amplifier, but the other was low impedance so that it could go straight into the board. Forrest White was the factory manager here back when I took over the company in '84. However, he had previously done a stint with us some years before where he was hired to do design work. And this was an instrument that he had come up with. Most unique is the headstock. And my dad and I looked at this instrument after Forrest did it and after he presented it and scratched our head and said, I don't think so. I don't think that's something that fits in our line. And he left in a little bit of a huff, and it wasn't very long thereafter that Music Man was founded. And there you go. It basically is a Music Man prototype, that headstock, that 3-in-1 headstock, which was designed in the Rickenbacker factory. This is the Lemmy Kilmister limited edition, and it's distinguished by the fact that it had a fully hand-carved top. Rather unique design, patterned after a military uniform. We've got the oak leaf and acorn cluster, something that Lemmy requested to be done. We only produced 60 of these instruments. It really was based on the prototype of the 4004 series instrument, so it is a 4004. Walnut body wings with the maple through body construction, satin finish throughout, and of course Lemmy's trademark 3 pickups and star inlays.
Over here we're looking at probably, arguably, your 3 most important, really, or iconic signature models. That's the Roger Mcguinn, Pete Townsend, and the John Lennon. It's not only nice to be associated with 3 of the biggest and probably most influential players of the 60s, but it must have been a kick, at least working with Roger and Pete on theirs.
Well, that's interesting because Pete Townsend was quoted as saying that he took some vicarious pleasure at destroying a few of our instruments because of the fact that he was the only one that could actually afford to do so. But at the same time, he's referred to them as a Stradivarius of electric guitars, and that it was actually because they were such a lightweight, delicate instrument, it was something that was relatively easy for him to destroy. But I would say that there was actually a great deal of respect in his thoughts about Rickenbacker, and you didn't actually see him destroy that many of them. A lot of the instruments were the same instrument put back together, and it was more of an act as opposed to anything else, I suppose. The whole design goal here was to try to replicate the sound that Roger originally got in the studio with an onboard compressor, treble booster, equipment that he had not previously been able to quite get the right sound when he was on stage. And we went to a lot of trouble to come up with a circuit that emulated that studio compression sound. So it was a first for us putting active electronics into a guitar.
All right, John, so we were just talking about the signature editions, John Lennon's among them, and this is actually has some relation to John's in particular, correct?
It sure does. It's kind of a Swiss cheese prototype, I would say. It's an old body that's never been sold. It's hung out in our factory ever since. The serial number plate showed that it was one number different than John Lennon's. So, of course, it provided a perfect opportunity for us to do some reverse engineering when we did the John Lennon limited edition series. And it's got the alder wood, the plywood back, and a lot of other little details that we really had to have access to in order to reverse engineer for the limited edition.
If we look over here to the right, this is perhaps for some readers and folks on the web a lesser known chapter in Rickenbacker's history, but a cool one, and a cool looking one, I might add, too.
Well, Rickenbacker produced amplifiers only for 60 years, and we tried all kinds of different things over the years. This was our first solid state series. The Transonics were rather unique in that they were extremely high power. The big version there was a 200-watt RMS amplifier, and it had a lot of innovative things such as the speakers used for cooling the transistors and some other overload protection. Actually quite a decent sounding amplifier for a solid state amp, and I really believe that had solid state been more accepted, that there would have been much more innovation and many more solid state transistorized amps today in use than there are now. Unfortunately, the reliability from some of the other manufacturers in solid state wasn't that good, and I think that poisoned the market for all solid state amplifiers.
Well, we could have hung out here all day, and maybe we will after all this is said and done, and that would be my pleasure. But we're going to sign off, and John, thanks very much for taking us around. It's been a pleasure, and really, I hope you all at home enjoy this very cool peek at this bit of Rickenbacker history. This is Charles for PremierGuitar.com.